Rachel's been a software engineer since 2012, a 3-times team lead, and enjoys live streaming her open source contributions on Twitch. She added a comparison validator to Rails, built the Jekyll-Twitch gem, and is working on an app for making friends at conferences. So that's pretty appropriate for something to use right now. Anywho, here she is.
Hello, Blue Ridge Ruby. I am here for your validators, to teach you about validators in Rails. From the title, you probably figured that out, that I would be talking about validators. But actually, I'd like to focus more on the demystifying Rails aspect, because I am fully aware that I am standing here before a group of 60-plus engineers of varying experience levels, and the vast majority of you have probably written something like this before, where we've got validates, 2 attributes, and then the presence validator is validating that those 2 attributes are present, and that if they're not, it allowed an error to the actual object that says start at or end at is blank, right? And I would even bet that some of you have done this before, where we're validating one attribute with multiple validators. So here we have the presence validator, but also the format validator, and it's joined by the uniqueness validator. A select group of you have probably even worked with validation helpers, like for example these. This is validates presence of, and that's the presence validator again, just in its jacket. And then also we have the comparison validator. This is my absolute favorite validator because, as Joe mentioned, I added it to Rails. Thank you so much for your validation. So when I added this validation helper, I actually added it in the same file as the validator. That's comparison.rb. And even though it is inside comparison.rb, it lives inside of the active model validations helper methods module. This method, if we look, starts at active model, or this function lives inside active model, but then inside that we have the module validations. And at that same level, we have the comparison validator itself and this module helper method, or helper methods. And then inside that, we have the function validates comparison of. So if we look at validates comparison of, what it's doing underneath the hood is it's simply calling validates with for the comparison validator and merging in any attributes that were passed to that method call. We can actually see this when we look at the Rails documentation. So if you take a look at the Rails documentation, we have this active model validations helper methods, and we can see at that top tier that it is sourcing these helper methods from each of the individual validator files that it's within, right? Also, if this documentation looks a little unfamiliar to you, you should probably be using api.rubyonrails.org, which is the official source of Rails documentation instead of API doc. So we know that validation helpers are in the same module but sourced from their separate files. Let's take a look at one of those separate files. Now, I know you're sitting here thinking, but Rachael, you're the creator of the comparison validator. Thank you for your validation. So why would you use the presence validator? And the answer is that it fit on the slide. So we're going to start here at the bottom. This is the validation helper, where we have that validates with presence validator. Then we have this entire section. This is the documentation for the validation helper. And then at the very top of the file, we have the presence validator itself, right? We can take a closer look at this presence validator to really understand how these validations are added within Rails. So we're going to start by inheriting from active model each validator. Every single validator that's part of the standard library is going to inherit from this exact same class. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to implement a method called validate each that's going to accept the record, the attribute name, and the attribute value. When we implement that method, what we're going to do is add an error to the record for the attribute name if the value is blank. This pattern is consistent across all validators that you create within Rails, right? We're going to have a record. We're going to add an error for the attribute name, or nothing if you'd like it to apply to the entire record. And then you're going to do that based on whether or not the value passes your validations. I want to take a moment to really dig into the active model each validator. First of all, this is what makes something a validator, but it also comes with a lot of custom options that can be really helpful. So one of them is allow nil. We've got allow blank as well. These are going to skip validations if the attribute is nil or blank. Then we have message. This is going to specify a custom error message. If we go back to that implementation of the presence validator that we saw before, we can actually see that we have access to these options and that we're passing it into record errors add. This is how we're overwriting the message when we work with these errors. Like, this is the entire implementation of the presence validator within Rails. And even though you don't see options passed in to validate each, you still have access to them because they're defined at a higher level on that active model each validator. In addition to this, we have on. This can be create or update. We have strict, which is going to raise a validation or raise an exception when the error fails, or when the validation fails. Sorry. We have if and unless. So this is going to specify when the validation should or should not occur, and it's going to specify that based on a custom method that you can write in Ruby and basically can do whatever you want. There's another really big thing that I kind of want to talk about with regards to active model each validator. So validations live in active model, not active record. Now, when I first started working with Rails, we were inheriting from active record base. So I was really familiar with active record, but I wasn't really familiar with active model. And nowadays we're working with application records, so we're even further from these actual components and what they are and what they mean. But this subtle distinction is why validators don't protect your database, why they can't. So Rails is composed of these framework components. This is Rails 7 to be particular. 12 gems with different responsibilities that are all set to require the same version. We're going to focus on active model and active record, but I do want to take a moment to acknowledge active support. So active support is what handles a lot of the magic of Rails. So for example, 12.days ago, things like that, that's all active support. If you've ever been on Stack Overflow and asked, like, how do I do this in Ruby? And somebody replies with an answer, and somebody else replies with, well, that's actually Rails. That's actually active support. So active support is really amazing because it is a separate gem, which means that if you're working inside of your Ruby applications, you can actually bring in active support to get the magic of Rails without actually using the rest of Rails. Let's get back to the focus of the talk, though, which is more about active model and active record. So active model is about Ruby objects with attributes, right? And then active record is about active models that are attached to a database. So attributes, validations, those are going to live in active model. Active record querying, that's going to live in active record. Database connections, active record. Everything related to databases, active record, right? And we can actually see this relationship when we look at the gems themselves. So if you take a look at active record and you look at the runtime dependencies, we can see directly that there's active model, which means active record depends on active model and has access to everything within it. If we go over here to active model, this does not depend on active record at all. It's not in the runtime dependencies. Because of this relationship of dependencies, we know that active model doesn't know active record or your database exists. The vast majority of validators, and we'll talk about the exceptions, live in active model, so none of those validators know that your database exists. Let's take a moment to talk about those validators really quickly. We have absence, acceptance, comparison. If you weren't aware, I added the comparison validator to Rails. Thank you to those of you who are in on the joke now. Then we have like length, numericality, presence, like a big long list of them. And then those exceptions are several validators that actually do live in active record. So these are validators that are aware that your database exists. Absence, length, numericality, and presence are going to use information from your database column in order to inform the parsing of the values within it. Numericality in particular will look at your database column type in order to understand the format of the number that it's trying to validate. There are two that are kind of separate from this. So there's associated, which is going to go through and it's going to run each of the associated records and check the validations of those. That must live in active record because active model has no idea what associations are, right? Like that concept of associations lives inside active record. The uniqueness validator is another one that's very interesting because it'll look at your entire database table and check to see if a particular attribute has a value that is unique. Now, the thing about the uniqueness validator is that it's prone to concurrency issues. And if we take a moment to think about what we just learned, that kind of makes sense, right? Like, active model doesn't even know a database exists. It's focused on looking at a Ruby object in a moment in time and checking the attributes of that Ruby object. So if I'm going out and I'm making this query to the database, I have nothing that actually ensures that that value remains unique if I've got two of these running at the same time. And I think that if you're looking at the uniqueness validator, and you understand those concurrency issues, you understand that validators don't replace database constraints. They can't. If you've got a vanilla uniqueness validator, it's probably time to start thinking about a unique index on that particular column in order to actually verify it, because your database does understand concurrency. As Daniel talked about earlier, it has locks to ensure that there's only one record being modified at a time. This is really reason number one why validations do not protect your database. And there's a reason I'm approaching it from this direction and that I'm going so in depth into this topic. I think that understanding the underlying technology really explains the emergent behavior. I think it's really frustrating when you look at a list of validators and you're like, why does one validator have a big angry red box in the Rails guide that says that it has concurrency issues, right? Like, understanding these relationships and what these components were designed to do helps you understand the problems, and it helps you understand where they're going to occur as well. Like, we just talked about the uniqueness validator, but you're probably thinking in the back of your head, you know, that associated validator, it goes out and it queries as well. If an associated record were updated at the same time, that might run into the same concurrency issues. We probably just don't notice and care as much as we do with the concurrency validator. And if you're talking about independent validators, that falls into the same category. Essentially, what it boils down to is this. If you know how it works, you know why it don't, right? So hopefully all this talk about how things works has you questioning, like, okay, well, what does Rails do when I actually call validates, right? If you remember from the third slide of this presentation, this is what validates looks like. We have attributes, we have validators, and we're gonna call these validators in order to put errors on our model for those attributes, right? Let's look into that actual method though. So the first thing validates does is it goes in and it checks for errors to make sure that you have called validates correctly. The next thing it does is it's going to find your validator. This is kind of interesting. So if you name, like any model, something validator, this section of code right here will go out and find that validator, regardless of whether it's a custom or standard library validator. And we can see this again when we look at the Rails documentation. So if we look at the Rails documentation, it says the power of the validates method comes when using custom validators and default validators in one call for a given attribute. We have this email validator, which is custom. And then down here, if we look at validates email, we have the presence validator, which is standard library, and the email validator, which is our custom one. This section of code that I have highlighted right here, these lines are the reason that this documentation is inside Rails and that you don't need to do any customizations to the email validator in order to call it within the validates command. The last thing it's going to do is it's going to call validates with. Now, hopefully this should feel a little bit familiar from our discussion about helper methods earlier. So, and also hopefully you're kind of wondering now, okay, well, what does validates with do? And this one's a little bit harder to highlight, but essentially what it does is it adds your validator and configured options to a hash called _validators on the model. So you're gonna have an attribute that is the key for each of these validators, and then it's going to have an array that has the actual validators with their options. Unfortunately, this array is a set of Ruby objects, so it doesn't screenshot very prettily, otherwise I would have one for you, and it's not very useful when you're actually looking at it. Thankfully, model.validators flattens that array out and makes it a lot easier for you to view. Okay, so at this point, we have a model, and we have validators attached to it. We added our validators. So now we can get our errors, right? Wrong. So in Rails, validator registration and running your validators are two separate processes. At this point, I would actually really love some audience participation. So let's talk about how validations happen. Would y'all mind calling out some methods that are going to call validations inside Rails? Valid question mark, fantastic one. So this is going to add errors to your model using callbacks and metaprogramming in that underscore validators attribute that we saw earlier. Can I get some more? Save. Sorry. Validate with an exclamation point. Interesting. So you as a collective audience have miraculously managed to call out these methods in the exact same order that I put them in my slides over a month ago. Excellent job to you, audience. Create, save, update, and create, save, update are all going to call your validations. But these actually all just call valid under the hood. They don't call anything else. And we can actually see that. So all 6 of these call save at some point, and save calls perform validations. And if we go look at perform validations, that's just got boop, valid right there. So it's really all just calling valid. Some other options that you might have shouted out could include some more interesting and spicy update methods, like for example, increment, upsert, this category, like update columns, this toggle one, but actually none of these call validations in any way, shape, or form. In fact, save itself, if you pass validate, does not call validations. And that really brings us to the second reason why validations do not protect your database. Which kind of begs the question, like, why do we use them? Right? Like, why do we use validations? The first one is that it's got great error messages and a really responsive API. The second is complex logic. Do you remember when we were talking about those options and we talked about how you could literally write a custom Ruby method and say if or unless there? Entirely possible. You can add, remove these without modifying the database or changing your constraints, without running any sort of migration. And most importantly, you can circumvent them in an emergency. So for example, if you had some sort of validation on a secret key and all of a sudden you needed to rotate that immediately, we have an entire list of methods that skip validations that would allow you to do that. We are going to go back and review the downsides, though. If you circumvent them in an emergency, even if the customer comes back in and they're just trying to modify their name, that secret key is going to keep the record itself invalid. So if you have any sort of invalid data there, it's going to prevent saving regardless of what you're trying to update. You shouldn't be using these for referential integrity or data integrity for the reasons that we just discussed, right? Like there are 2 different ways to avoid and circumvent these. The other one is a downside and an upside. So new validations don't check old data. This is kind of a downside because it means you've got invalid data in your database, which as we previously learned is going to prevent you from saving that record regardless of which attribute you're trying to update. But the upside to this is that if you were to introduce a new constraint around like name or something like that, the next time the customer goes in to update that record, they will run against the validation. So you are not the one making decisions for them about what they should use and what should be passed. They're the ones making that decision. We've talked a lot about the theory, and I think it's probably time to take a break and do some practical work. So let's start talking about how to build your own custom validator, because custom validators let you validate anything or anyone. Oh my gosh, I didn't even do the claps. Y'all were so ready. You must like me. All right, so the first question we're gonna ask is where should my custom validator live? First off, you can put it in models in your app. That's a perfectly valid place. You can put it in lib as long as you require or auto-load those validators where you need them. You can put it in a gem. This is one of my favorite places to put it because it's nicely abstracted. You can bring it into other projects easily, validates timeliness of, validates date times, and it's a fantastic example of a gem that contains a validator. The last option here is in Rails. Now, I have helpfully ordered this list from the fastest way to get a validator in your app to the slowest way to get a validator in your app. So let's take a moment to talk about what it looks like to add your validator to Rails. So first, you're going to create your validator and your tests and your docs and your changelog, which I forgot when I added the comparison validator. Next, you're going to convince a member of Rails core or Rails committers that it should be added to the standard library. You're going to complete the review process. of your validator and your tests and your docs and your changelog, and it's quite exhaustive. You're gonna wait for the next Rails release to happen in order for that validator to be available. And the last thing you're gonna do is upgrade your application. And I know you're sitting there wondering, Jill, how do you know so much about this process? Did I mention I added the comparison validator to Rails? Did I mention it took over a year? So I want you to have realistic expectations. I'm having a lot of fun up here with you all today, and the comparison validator is genuinely one of the technical accomplishments that I am proudest of in my career thus far. But the reality is I'm talking here to 60 plus of you, and Rails does not need 60 plus new validators in its standard library. It does, however, need 60 plus new contributors. It needs people looking at issues, reproducing them, creating scripts, actually solving issues, working with documentation. But again, I want you to have realistic expectations about what this looks like. And this was part of the reason I wanted to focus so much on where should my custom validator live, because there are many places it can live outside of Rails itself. By the way, if you build your validator in one of these other places, that can actually really help your argument when you are trying to convince one of those members of the Rails core team and Rails committers team, because you can prove that it has production value, and a lot of Rails is based on extracting that as well. Now that you've selected where you're going to put your validator, let's name it. So we're going to name it something validator. If you remember that validates command from earlier, it's going to be able to pick up anything that you name something validator. You're going to inherit from active model each validator. If you're doing this inside of models or lib, easy peasy, you don't have to worry about anything. But if you're doing this inside of a gem, active model is going to become one of the dependencies of your gem, just like we saw for active record. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to implement a validate each method. So we talked about this validate each, which has record, attribute name, and value. And it's going to follow the exact same pattern that we laid out before. We have a record. We add an error to that attribute name if our value here does not pass the validations that we've set up before. And lastly, optionally, you want to add a validation helper. We talked about how this can live outside of any specific place, how it can live inside of your application, but still be added onto that helper methods module. You can also place it anywhere that your application has access to. So, guess what? We just made a validator! Yay! If you want access to this, here's a gift. I know it's very hard to click right now, but right after this talk, a blog post is going to go up on my site that has my slides, and you can find that site here at chael.codes. So chael.codes/about is going to tell you a little bit more about me. chael.codes/links is going to have the social links. And if you've got a favorite social media profile, you can search for @chaelcodes and probably find me there. I want to say thank you to a few very specific people. I want to say thank you to Matthew D, who reviewed this talk for technical correctness and also merged the comparison validator. I want to say thank you to Carmen Huidebro and Kevin Murphy, who very last minute reviewed this talk for flow and any issues and gave me a lot of really great feedback on it. I want to say thank you to the Blue Ridge Ruby organizers, Mark Locklear and Joe Peck. If it weren't for them, I wouldn't be here on stage talking to you about validators today, and they put together an absolutely amazing conference, and they should be thanked for all of the incredible work they've done. And last but not least, I would like to say thank you to all of you whose hands are now probably tired, because I very much appreciate you indulging me in my silliness, validating me, and having a little fun with me today. All right, thank you all so much. If you have questions, I don't have lunch plans, and that can start now because this talk is over.